Well, thank you very much, Tim. That was a marvellous, wide-ranging, well-informed, almost sensational introduction, I thought. I had been warned that I needed to open the field in a conventional way, but I see no need to do that at all. I can move straight on to the theme that I want to take out, which is really to assume that we all of us know what endangered languages are. If we didn't know, we know now thanks to Tim, and to think why this is an issue that should concern us. Why should we protect endangered languages, in fact? This is something that comes up whenever one is in an interview with one of the major media. They will always ask, well, why is it worth worrying about these languages anyway? I thought that would be a good question to try to give a bit of a novel answer to. So what I'm going to do is talk ethics with you to start with, and then illustrate my ethical texts with one or two examples from history, and leave it to my distinguished colleagues who have a recent experience of working with endangered languages and think of what can be done for such languages to make them less endangered and possibly even vital in the future. I happen to be the chairman of something called the Foundation for Endangered Languages. This is a charity which has been going for about 15 years now, and here is our raison d'etre. We exist to support, enable and assist the documentation, protection and promotion of endangered languages. Now those are three different things, and they are all important in this field. Documentation is all about getting a record of a language, especially if the language looks as if it's not going to be around very much longer. You can do all sorts of things with that record, but unless you do get that record, there's little you can do when the language goes out of existence. On the other hand, and at the other end, when you're thinking about the future of the language, you may want to try to reverse the arrow of time, so to speak, to reverse the trend, to make a language which has been losing speakers gain speakers in the future. That's called the process of language revitalization. So that's the past and the future, if you like. What I'm now going to talk about is protection. How can we, or rather, why should we protect languages which look like they're losing speakers? So I make no apologies for taking a very ethical view of this here, and I thought we should go to the master when we come to trying to answer an ethical question. Ethics is a notoriously sticky area. Immanuel Kant tries to get some content for what there would be in ethics from the very nature of ethics itself, of a moral law. What he came up with something is something we know as the categorical imperative, which in its simplest form is act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. So ethics has to be universal or it is nothing. That's what he's really saying there. And a little bit later on in the same discussion, he talks about viewing other people as means to an end, as against viewing them as ends in themselves. And it is the view of other agents as ends in themselves which is the distinctively ethical one. By contrast, perhaps more in the positivist Anglo-Saxon tradition, it's all about what you could get away with, perhaps. Life can sometimes seem to be a zero-sum game. If we win, you lose. So in order for us to win, you have to lose. That sort of idea is behind the idea that endangered languages are unnecessary luxuries from the past, other people's luxuries, of course, not our own, and they're in our way. We have this phrase, dog eat dog. I rather prefer the Sanskrit equivalent of that, which is called Matsya Nyaya. Matsya is a fish, Nyaya is one of the branches of philosophy known as logic. So this is fish logic. And here we have a nice illustration of fish logic at its harshest. And it's because people have looked at the nature of the situation of languages in the world in this sort of way that English has sometimes been called a killer language. The idea is that people take up English and so they're going to lose their other languages. The other languages must die. Now, actually, this is a rather considerable misconception, largely based on the worldview of people who are monolingual themselves. They think if they're going to take up our language, obviously they have to lose their own. Now, the majority of the world's population are actually bilingual. They know this is a lie, or at least they would know this lie if they stopped to think about it, but they tend to buy into the propagated lies of the richer, less than half of the world, who are predominantly monolingual, it has to be said. But if, on the other hand, we were to look at this project in the same way that we looked at the need for having a good life in our own society, if you want to get on with other people, you don't sweep them aside saying there's no room for them because you've got to do what you need to do. Rather, you look for good neighbourliness. They'll do their thing and you can do yours. You might even be concerned to protect others' rights. Some people say that is essential to a good society. And even in the law of landlord and tenant, as it was interpreted to me by my father, who used to practice as a solicitor not 10 minutes walk away from here, the landlord's duty to his tenant is to allow him undisturbed enjoyment of what he already has. That would be a reasonable way for the legislators and policy leaders relevant to major languages to view the minority languages of the world. Another thing I learnt from my father apparently is a legal maxim, sic utere tuo ut alienum non laedas. Now, I'm sure few in this audience will need a translation of that, but I have provided one for the very few, probably the monolingual English speakers, who would like it. So use your own that you do not hurt what belongs to another. This is all we are asking for. This is the ethical basis of the endangered language protection movement. You see, members of an endangered language speech community may sometimes be caught saying that I wish we didn't speak this language because then we wouldn't have so many problems. Famously, Peter Ladefoged, a phonetician at the at UCLA in California, was doing work with a Dahalo speaker in East Africa who said that he didn't want his children to learn the language because it would just be too much trouble for them. They'd be much better off knowing Gikuyu or Swahili or even English. And Peter Ladefoged said, well, who am I as a linguist to oppose that? But the fact is that not all the speakers of Dahalo have that view, but they get pushed into giving up on their language, whether they're constrained by circumstances, bullied by people in power, urged by the mass media, or simply cajoled by the rising generation, their young children even, to do so that they could be part of something bigger than themselves. In the old days, it was in order to be a good citizen of the empire, or nowadays, it's so that you can take part in the world economy. You shouldn't stand in the way of progress. I used to hear that all the time in the 1950s, 1960s. Interesting, we don't hear so much about it nowadays. And administrators may also wish to make sure that there are fewer languages because it means fewer forms to be drafted and directed to particular agencies and particular populations. Perhaps more seriously, traditionally, people have thought that if there are many languages spoken in my domain, I'm going to have trouble with political divisiveness. Let's try and iron that out. So the speakers of the endangered languages are the ones who are supposed to pay the costs for all these things. They're the ones who've got something to lose. Nobody else is losing anything, except in terms of world heritage. But the problem is that the rewards they are offered usually for giving up on their languages are all rather bogus. Okay, there is this big empire, there is this big world economy, but who is going to get access to it? Are you actually going to get access to it as a result of giving up what makes you distinctive? Whose progress is being promoted? I mean, in great organizations, great empires, great lands, different social groups will progress differently. Is there, in fact, only one path to a desirable future? Maybe different people should be doing different things, and maybe they'll do better, all of them, severally, by thinking about their own future. If we look at the administrative arguments for getting rid of endangered languages, because they just get in the way, why are they in the way? They're in the way because it's assumed that the people who speak them need to be looked after specially, and the language makes it difficult to get at them. But will those people actually gain by being dependent on welfare? Perhaps policy ought to be directed in the opposite direction. And most important of all, I think these political divisions that we see, they merge people into a larger unit if they are lost. So identities are lost. People's sense of who they are is inevitably diminished. Now, they may gain something by feeling that they're taking part in the great achievements of US foreign policy or UK foreign policy. It's difficult to see quite what else they will get out of it. The real point about all this is that it's based on a misconception. The idea that there's a zero-sum game, that if you gain, you have to lose your language in order to gain other things. Actually, you don't gain anything by losing a language. You just lose that language. You've got to look to gain and to learn another language, perhaps. But by learning another language, you don't lose your own. There's no reason you should lose your own. Even if you could say that getting rid of the minority languages means that there's less scope for discrimination, human societies are quite good at finding discrimination, and it's largely in order to keep outsiders out. You find a reason to discriminate against them. If they speak your language now, you'll think of other things that they've got that's not quite right about them. They don't have the right degree of education, they have the wrong accent, they come from the wrong part of town or whatever. So, inevitably, when we lose these differentiations, the wider community is diminished. Its cultural wealth as a whole, by definition, is diminished. You might say that there are certain forms of cultural wealth that we don't want. I mean, considering the moral problem which confronted people in the British Empire, working what to do about sati in the early 19th century, this was a hallowed Indian tradition to burn widows. Perhaps we should do something about stamping it out. Similarly, with Tagi, the murdering of people who were walking from one part of India to another, that needed to be stamped out. You could look at what happened in Portugal's conquest of Brazil, where cannibalism was widespread. Some forms of, I mean, the argument I'm making has its limitations, because you might say that there are higher, possibly categorical imperative considerations, which means that we don't actually want to have a rule which says it's okay to eat other people or to burn them. But in general, of course, cultural variety is not as dangerous or as evidently deleterious as that. So it's clear, whatever you do, that when you lose this language, you are going to lose elements of cultural identity and cultural goods. Now, what I'm going to do very quickly now, just seeing how I'm doing, is to give some examples of the past. Now, my friends are going to be giving examples of language endangerment in the present, but this is an issue which is really as old as humanity, and it's certainly as old as human imperialism and human civilization. So what I wanted to quickly do is have a look at these cases in the past. The case of the Gauls in the Roman Empire, the Tupi-speaking Indians in Brazil, the Ubykh in Tsarist Russia. That takes us through the last 2 millennia quite well. And then we can look at some people who are on the other side of history, people who managed to hang on to their language one way or another, and see what the effect of that was on them. So let's consider, to start with, this conquest of the Gauls, the central achievement, you could say, of the Roman Empire was achieved by Julius Caesar from 59 to 49 BC, conquering the top 2/3 of what they called Gallia, and we now think of as France. There's a famous picture here of the Gaulish general Vercingetorix on his way to surrender to Julius Caesar at the last there. This is what, it's quite interesting actually that one has to take one's hat off to our cousins, the French, in that they try to, in their art, to some extent dramatize some of these things that we all know about, that the Romans conquered Gaul. So what did it mean for actual people at the time? And it's quite nice to see somehow the scale of a Roman camp and how big it must have seemed, how intimidating it must have seemed, even to someone who was a general on behalf of most of the Gaulish population at the time. So this is Lamotte's picture of the surrender of Vercingetorix. Now, what Caesar was doing, and this is not what you find in Caesar's Gallic Wars, was leading to the decline and extinction of the culture which produced the picture you see in front of you. This is what was taken of the Gundestrup cauldron. It's actually found in Denmark, but it shows items of what must have been an extremely complicated story, which was the myth of this god Cernunnos, about which we now know nothing. This is what happens when people give up their language and they inevitably give up their culture. You could say that they were doing perfectly well, and in the 3 or 4 centuries it took for Gaulish to die out, to be replaced all over what is now France by a form of Latin which developed into French, different forms of French, of course, Occitan as well as Francian. But that procedure, which actually was also accompanied with the spread of the Christian religion around France, led to the loss of an exceedingly complicated, learned tradition of doctrine and of story, which we know was there because Caesar does tell us that it took people 20 years in order to get fully educated as a druid in the Gaulish tradition. It's all gone. We don't know what it was. We're all the poorer by this. And there were some amazing things here, you see. Commercial advertising had realized that sex sells in the 1st century AD in Gaul. Here is a completely bit of gratuitous eye candy from a potter's stamp from Rouen in the 1st century AD. All it says in Gaulish is, made by Rectuganos, son of Sulla, and if you remember the pot, you may not remember why you remember the pot. Now, what the Romans had done was effectively replace the previous much less systematic and certainly less literate imperial power which had taken over Europe before them, which was the Gauls, and who apparently did it on the basis of their skill in iron foundry. They were the first civilization to bring iron to Europe. Now, what the Romans did in those 5 centuries from 100 BC to 400 AD was to have this language neutralizing effect in a vast area across most of the Mediterranean as well as Western Europe. In the lands under Roman administration, there had been 60 languages, we know, when they started. It went down to 12 in that period. And outside Africa and the East, half of those figures fell to less than half. So from 30 we went down to 5. In fact, we can say what those 5 languages were: Latin, Welsh, Basque, Albanian, and Gaulish. And we've just seen that Gaulish was not long for this world in 400 AD. Other languages are just names: Lusitanian, Celtiberian, Tartessian, Iberian, Ligurian, Lepontic, Rhetic, Venetic, Etruscan, Piscine, Oscan, Messapian, Sicyl, Sardinian, Dacian, Getic, and Paeonian. So that was where they were on the map of Europe in 500 BC. Little did they know they were not long for this world. 1,000 years later, Latin was everywhere where you can see horizontal lines on this map. So we've got much. It wasn't exactly a monoculture because there was this matter of the Germanic invasions, which came in the 5th century AD and brought Germanic languages as a sort of overlay across the Romance languages, something we don't tend to remember so much now because we think of the languages which have remained as the Romance languages, or as the French say, the néo-romains. So they are the ones we think that came from Roman. They were affected, however, to some extent, superficially, at least, by Germanic languages. But inevitably, the number of languages there is much fewer than it was before. So that is what we lost when the Romans came. And we perhaps gained. The Romans did many things for us, but they certainly didn't leave us with linguistic diversity. And the result was that a lot of things got lost to this wonderful, all-encompassing Roman civilization. If we flip forward now by 1,000 years and start thinking about the next great wave of European expansion, which came with the Portuguese and the Spanish, we can look at what happened in Brazil. Now, when the Portuguese got to Brazil, by and large, they didn't go very deep into it. They stuck on the coasts, which for many centuries they went on disputing with the French, who were also trying to become the imperial power in Brazil at the time. Ultimately, they lost, and so we don't tend to think of Brazil as being a potential French colony, but it was. However, while they were doing this fighting along the coast, there were also the people who lived there who were having a perfectly nice time, as far as they were concerned, which largely involved speaking various dialects of the Tupi language. So Tupinamba, Tupiniquim. I don't know whether you can see the names along the edge of the coast there. You probably can't. They did themselves up in finery, which largely left them naked, but would often involve them in very fine feathered headdresses. And whenever they could catch one of their neighbours, they would tend to eat them. And this was sort of this, and this particularly repelled the Portuguese who encountered there. Sometimes when people were caught, they were Portuguese and claimed to be French, or French claimed to be Portuguese, or Germans claiming to be either. And this tended to have a bad effect on their survival possibilities because they were seen as allied with the wrong tribe and hence liable to be eaten. Now, this was a different culture which was largely purged of its cannibalism by the Roman Catholic Church in the following century, particularly by the actions of Jesuits, who were particularly good at learning the language and setting up Christian communities, or sort of communes, which flourished for a good 200 years. They also spread the languages of the coast, which was Tupi, into the innermost parts of Brazil, along the routes which you can see shown here. As it happens, all the languages of the coast seem to be related to each other. People don't know whether they originally came from the south or from the north. But anyway, they were spread into the interior by the Portuguese, and the community remained fairly underpopulated, one could say. It had nothing like the kind of vast population now that there is in Brazil for those 2 centuries. But the Jesuits were able, through continuing use of the language which they found there, and indeed spreading it to some extent around the country, to create a sort of, they called it a sort of paradise. They were not impelled by the profit motive, and they simply continued with subsistence farming while they taught each other about Christianity. And then, for political reasons in Europe, the Enlightenment came along, and the Spanish government, first the Portuguese government and then the Spanish government, decided to abolish the Jesuits. They pulled them out. Before they pulled them out, strangely enough, two years earlier, they abolished the use of the Tupi language. These things do happen. And the result has been that since that time, Portuguese has spread at the expense of Tupi all round Brazil. We have actually lost any real concept of what Tupi culture and civilization was like. Much more recently, here's an example from the 20th century, started in the 19th, with the expulsion of various Central Asian tribes from north of the Caucasus by the Tsar's armies. From 1763 to 1864, the Russians conquered the Caucasus, and various peoples were expelled, notably the Ubykh, who were one variety of Circassians who came from the northeastern area of the Black Sea. They left in a gang, in a party, around 1864, and largely moved to the Ottoman Empire, where they set up not far from Istanbul, round the coast of the Sea of Marmara. And what they decided to do as a deliberate policy, so as not to cause trouble, in order to effectively to survive individually, they gave up on their language. They learnt Turkish, and this man, Tevfik Esenç, was the last speaker of Ubykh. He died in 1992. Now, as it happens, he himself was a very scholarly individual and worked with a French linguist, Georges de Mézil, through the second half of the 20th century to document his language. So documentation was important. But the language and the culture and this vast vital energy, really, of a people, you can see, who did themselves up. As you can see, already in the 19th century, they were still wearing these great furry helmets. And it is still possible to find out a little bit about what the music was like, what the dancing was like. And there is a literature called the Nart sagas, which you may have heard of, which tell us about the particularly adventurous approach that they had to history and legend. But it's a dead culture. It's gone. On the other hand, we can see cultures which have survived. I don't need to tell you very much about the Basques. They're well known within modern Europe. They have survived, as we were being told earlier this afternoon, the attentions of General Franco, but they also was similarly threatened by the actions of the Visigothic kingdom. So Goths in the 6th century AD threatened them. They retained their identity then, and they've retained it in the 20th century. Let's look at another very different sort of situation where a lingua franca, which was Aramaic, had been adopted by a religious organization, namely the Christian Church in the East, and spread out over 1,000 years all the way from Anatolia to China. They have retained their faith, and they have retained, vestigially, they have retained their language over that long period. In fact, it's 2,000 years now. They're still there. They are the priests of the Jacobite branch of these Syriac speakers. It's more than a coincidence that a surviving ethnic group hangs on to its language. A language turns out to be an extremely important thing to keep the identity of a group together. And in a completely different context, let's consider the case, finally, of the Pipil, who are a group of outliers of the Nahuatl. So they were they spoke effectively the same language as the Aztecs. And a couple of hundred years before the advent of Spaniards or anybody to Latin America, sorry, not or anybody, but anybody European to Latin America, they had established themselves in a group in the south. The Aztecs obviously dominated in central Mexico. This is a group, you can see, which is not in Mexico, nor is it in Guatemala, which is the country just to the south of Mexico. It's in what is now El Salvador. It's a dialect of Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, which has survived until this day. It's just dying out probably in our own generation. An example, an appropriate sentence, ni takat, sorry, I am a man. And you can see the first generation of Spanish conquistadores attempted to subjugate this group, failed. You can see a picture of them shooting backwards and forwards into doing that. And you can see another resistance movement in the late 19th century, led by a man called Feliciano Ama, whose picture you can see on the right-hand side here, also maintaining the independence of the people, their identity preserved by their continued use of this language. So we've looked at three losers and three groups of people who, for a time at least, have become winners, quite against the grain. In a nutshell, why should we protect endangered languages? Because if we don't, those communities will vanish with all their distinctive life and their identities, almost as if they had never been. That's the effect of losing endangered languages. Thank you very much.
The International Phonetic Association, they have a booklet which gives all the sounds that humans can make. With these endangered languages, do they fit in?
Yes, indeed. They make use of the same repertoire of potential speech sounds that every other language. There's nothing about endangered languages which distinguishes them other than their political situation where they have become endangered. Latin is a language which went round the whole of Europe. Its close relative, Oscan, was very influential in southern Italy for a number of centuries BC, but ultimately was completely effaced by Latin.
They are comparable languages, and if you wanted to learn Oscan, you would learn the same conjugations and declensions that you learn when you learn Latin, but a little bit different. But Oscan couldn't cut it politically. It's gone. So there's nothing about the substance of an endangered language which makes it a funny language in some way. It just means there are so many of them that there is a great variety in there.
Yes. I think it's also worth touching on another misnomer that what people might consider to be primitive languages are in any way less complex than modern languages today. And I think there are some languages which have been studied where there are some phenomenal number of vowel sounds by using different parts of the mouth that we wouldn't normally expect in Western languages.
Yes, I can be corrected by my colleagues here, but one tends to talk about the variety of consonants which will be found in languages of the Caucasus. So you do find different sorts of languages specialize in different ways and become linguistically interesting in different areas. But it is usually the case that the kind of things that people appeal to as showing a language of civilization, like the complicated case systems and conjugation systems, say, of Latin, are more characteristic of less urbanized languages than they are of others. So that, in a way, English is, with its rather simple grammatical structure, is characteristic of an imperial language in a way that Latin looks rather strange as an imperial language. But they're both equally imperial, and so, as I just said, it's the politics which makes the difference, not the substance of the languages.
You talked about holding two languages as being a zero-sum game. Aren't human beings, though, intrinsically lazy and trying to learn and maintain on a day-to-day basis two languages? Isn't that an overhead that a lot of us would find very difficult to maintain?
Thank you. Yes, I agree with that totally. In fact, it's one of the major points I make in my recent book, The Last Lingua Franca, that what the nature of global lingua francas shows us is that if people can get by with one language, they will. They don't have to, however, and typically the people who live in small groups, perhaps dominated by larger groups who live nearby, have to make the effort to learn other languages. Recent psycholinguistic studies, of course, show that they are the gainers by this, that people who are bilingual at a deep level tend to end up more intelligent by tests, and they may even live longer. So it may be that this laziness, which is what being native speakers of a world lingua franca enables us to indulge, is not ultimately in our best interests.
Well, of course, what cheers me up is the research which tells us that the more languages you speak, the less likely you are to fall prey to Alzheimer's disease in later life. So I'm looking forward to living to 120. The curious thing, of course, about language is horses for courses. Where you are in a multilingual community, there are people that you speak one language to simply because you get through to them more easily. That's a language which has self-selected in terms, you meet someone, you say hello, they say bonjour, you realise your French is better than their English, you switch into French. I remember once in Guernsey, and I'm afraid I don't know what the language of Guernsey is called, but I was quite impressed with Guernsey.
Guernsey.
There we are, I knew the man would know. Guernsey
This
French, I
guy's
think.
got a specialist in his group.
I was afraid we wouldn't, a Gresham audience. And it was interesting, I was staying in a hotel in Guernsey, and I heard this sort of slightly odd language, I have to say, outside my window one morning, and the receptionist was talking to the bin man, and she came in and said, "Oh, that's my French for the week." And he was a Guernsey man, and she was from Guernsey, and for some reason, she spoke Guernsey French to this particular bloke on Tuesday mornings when he came to collect the bins. For some reason, that was a strategy which had emerged over the years. They were either more comfortable, or this established a bond between them because there was a load of English speakers from the mainland in the hotel, so we'll say what we like about them because they won't understand. The person you have to emulate is King Charles V, who said that I speak English to my bankers, French to my mistress, Spanish to God, and German to my horse. Another question. He said it, folks. One off at the back there, back there.
I'm a bit mystified how primitive languages start. Does a committee in the village sort of come together and say, well, that sound will be that sound will be, bread will be this, and how do primitive languages sort of start in the first place?
I think this is a bit beyond our theme. The languages are there. Some people do look at the origin of languages, particularly looking at how Creoles get started, say, where children are in a sort of quandary as to knowing what language to speak, because different people are speaking different languages around them and they don't get enough experience of any of them. They do make something up, which turns out to be an effective language and may actually start, so Pidgin English developed in this way and what's happened to Portuguese, which was an imperial language spoken around the Indian Ocean, has developed into a Creole with mixtures of other languages in those coastal communities. How languages started off before there were any other languages is a matter of deep speculation.
But we do have some interesting examples. You mentioned Creoles. The fascinating one which is beginning to emerge is London Creole, where you have a London school with 57 languages spoken amongst the children, many of whom don't speak English or speak it very basically when they first arrive, and they're reaching for ways for making themselves understood. And a simplified grammar emerges and a fairly common basic vocabulary. I think it's might even be measured down to as low as 500 words. They can actually get through the day before they start understanding English better, and typically start to speak English very well within about a year. Writing takes that much longer. There's also an interesting example one of our experts might be able to help me with, which is Nicaraguan Sign Language. With all of the disruption of the Sandinista revolution, children who had speaking and hearing difficulties were very much marginalized, and it was discovered that they had in fact found a way of communicating with each other, and apparently this sort of language, which was totally intelligible to a fairly large group of children, had emerged during a revolutionary period of perhaps 10 to 15 years. I don't know if anybody else knows. I mean, I've not even got chapter and verse on that. That's anecdotal. Peter, can you help us on that? You're nodding. I don't know. Quick, get a microphone down here to a man who can tell us.
I don't know all of the details, but what you described is roughly the case, that in fact after the revolution had established, deaf schools were restarted, and then when the children came together, they mutually created a mutually intelligible sign system, which is a full grammatical language with its own structure and so on.
Yes. So if we can find out how they did it, we could answer your question. There's another question down here. We have to watch the time a bit now then.
Thanks, I'd like to thank you for the speaker and also for your wonderful introduction. I found both fascinating. The talk that Dr. Ostler gave was dealing with history, and I was impressed by his allusions to trade and colonialism having an effect on languages and their disappearance. I would like him to speculate on the following. China has 1 in 6 of the population at the moment. It's buying up considerable chunks of Africa, mainly to exploit the resources. Its pattern of trade, export trade, certainly is increasing a lot. And I wonder to what extent China will displace English as at the moment the only international lingua franca, and perhaps English might even disappear altogether.
You wrote a book on that.
Yes, how kind of you to play into my hands. I have it. The last lingua franca is precisely about this. The point about world lingua francas, indeed lingua francas generally, is that they are acquired deliberately. As I say, through recruitment. You have a reason for wanting to learn them, so you do so. One would expect, regardless of what the Chinese do with their Confucian institutes and so on, that in Africa, where there are business opportunities which involve attracting Chinese to come and deal in your part of the world, you have an inducement to try and learn Chinese, to try and put Chinese at their ease. And so one would predict that in Africa particularly, I think, that there will be a growth of Chinese as a lingua franca, almost regardless of what the Chinese do as a matter of policy. The thing about the current global lingua francas, particularly English, but preceding it French, was that they did involve global powers who had meddled and established settlements in very different parts of the world. This meant that people who happened to have been affected by the English, or previously by the French in different parts of the world, found that for no particular reason of their own, they could talk to people on the other side of the world who had also been similarly affected. And this was a major factor in the utility of French and then English as global lingua francas. It seems less likely that this is going to happen in this century or subsequent centuries, simply because of the level of development all around the world is more on a par. It's not possible for one power to take over and simply establish itself in different parts of the world, essentially willy-nilly for the population there. So I think it's going to be quite difficult for future economically dominant powers to be as linguistically dominant as English has become. But they will no doubt be economically dominant, and they will probably be culturally dominant as well, because people tend to like singing the songs that go with these...
Singing Peking opera?
Oh, why not?
Yeah, there's a challenge.
Yes.
Yes, it is an interesting question, and I hope that militates in favour of, again, government language policy in terms of looking at emerging world languages, especially Chinese and Arabic. So in this particular session, I leave you to ponder the fact that on 9/11, there were more postgraduate students in American universities studying Latin and Greek than there were studying Arabic. In the meantime, I would like to thank Nicholas very much indeed for kicking off this afternoon's session. Very, very well informed, very informative. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you.
You left off, right?